You ready? Well, good evening. I just want to make sure you're awake, right? So that's good. Welcome. I'm glad you guys are here for the evening session of the Newsmaker interviews, and we're delighted to welcome this evening Gerald Tucker, who is the author of Conservative Heroes, 14 Leaders Who Shaped America from Jefferson to Reagan. Through him, we learn a lot more about the Americans' conservative heroes, not just the well-known ones, but those who are often forgotten. His extensive research on conservative principles has given us a much better idea of how Americans' foundational principles formed the modern conservative movement. Mr. Tucker has written for National Review, The Washington Times, and other leading publications, and he is a frequent media guest who has appeared on television networks such as MSNBC and C-SPAN and on major national and local radio programs. Mr. Tucker, we're honored to welcome you to our campus, and students, let's give him a round of applause.
Well, thank you for coming this evening. Thank you for being here.
Glad to be here.
Let's start out. How does a banker turn into an historian?
Well, I'm not sure I have turned into an historian, but I've always been interested in history, and I think that's one of the values of a liberal arts education is that you, if you've got an interest, in my case it was history. I had the opportunity to study it in college, and it's been sort of a lifelong passion or side pursuit. And it was only recently that I decided to try to take my hand at writing a book. So I'm not sure I'd say I've really turned into an historian, but I guess I'm closer to it than I have been anyway.
So students' major here does not determine the whole course of their lives?
I would certainly argue that's true. Some of the most meaningful things that you'll pursue in life are not necessarily tied to your career.
Yeah. Okay, let's talk about some of these folks here. How many of you have heard of the tertium quids? Okay, we have one brave soul over here. I'm not going to interrogate you, but who were the tertium quids?
Well, first of all, it's pretty remarkable that somebody could raise his hand. They're not a well-known group. They were a group of Jeffersonian politicians, Jeffersonian Democrats, or Republicans as they were called then, who came into office. Most of them were elected in 1800 when Jefferson was elected, and were big supporters of Jefferson in his first term. They became increasingly concerned about what they saw as a tendency for Jefferson first and then Madison, who succeeded him, to be a little more expansive in their view of the role of the federal government. So the tertium quids function really as I think the term in Latin means third thing, and they were really like a party within a party. They were in their view, they were the true Jeffersonians.
So you had the Federalists, you had the Jeffersonians, and then you had the third thing.
The third thing, and they were the hardcore Jeffersonians.
Okay, so we often hear about Jefferson and Madison as small government guys, essentially, looked upon sometimes as conservative heroes. Not for the tertium quids, though.
Well, that's exactly true, exactly right. I think the tertium quids were the real hardcore limited government guys. And in fact, the first chapter in the book focuses on Jefferson and Madison, and it focuses very narrowly for a reason. It focuses on the 12 years during the Federalist administration, Washington and then Adams. And it was that 12-year period when Jefferson and Madison were really laying down their views while in the opposition to the Federalists, and laid down some of the key principles of limited government. Now, once they got into office, again, they became a little bit more expansive than they had been.
What worried the tertium quids the most about Jefferson?
Well, I think it was just in their view, a good example was the Louisiana Purchase. They felt that was not in the Constitution and that Jefferson should not have acted just summarily to grab it. They were reluctant reluctant to spend money on anything. They thought the states should spend money for internal improvements. They were not in favor of what became well, say the Whig program or Henry Clay's program of canals and internal improvements. They just were not, they were a very limited government.
So the two leaders of them, I mean, Nathaniel Macon was Speaker of the House at one point, right? And John Randolph was chairman of the House Ways and Means Committee, which then is now, was probably the most powerful committee in the House. Anything particular about those two people that's, I mean, besides their positions, what were they like as individuals?
Well, they were very, well, first of all, they were very principled individuals. They were men who knew exactly what they believed and didn't deviate from those beliefs. But as individuals, they were very different personalities. They were, and interestingly, they were lifelong friends. Randolph was from the southern part of Virginia. Macon was from the northern part of North Carolina. So they lived very close to each other on the Roanoke River. And they roomed together in Washington for 30-some years and were just very close friends, but very different personalities. Randolph was a brilliant orator. I mean, someone who could just keep the House spellbound with his speeches. I think it was Russell Kirk who said that some of Randolph's speeches were probably the greatest that any American's ever given. He was very flamboyant. He would stride into the House with his riding boots on, his hounds trailing behind him, and cause quite a stir. On the
dogs allowed?
Well, apparently. So, and he was a pretty contentious. He could be very gracious, but he also didn't mind a fight. And he experienced a number of ups and downs. He was elected to the Senate in Virginia, then he lost an election, and then he came back to the Senate. Macon, on the other hand, was a very consistent. Had a very consistent personality, might even have been considered somewhat dour, was someone who was universally liked and respected and was never lost an election in North Carolina, was just revered. He was Speaker of the House under Jefferson, then stayed in the House after Jefferson, then was elected to the Senate, retired voluntarily when he was 70 years old. Just thought it was time to retire. And so Macon was, there were a couple of funny things that were said about Macon, that he held the record, certainly as far as North Carolina went, for having cast more no votes than any other member of Congress. And Jesse Helms was very envious of that record, but according to Jesse Helms, Macon really had the record.
Did they call him the abominable no man?
Well, but one of Macon's friends one day stood up in the Senate, I think he was in the Senate by that time, and said Macon had just made the speech against spending any money for anything, and had voted against it, of course. And the friend said, you know, if Mr. Macon were ever to drown in a river, you would look upstream for him, not downstream. So he's constantly bucking the tide. So there were two very colorful characters, and according again to some of the work Russell Kirk did, they really kept alive the original Jeffersonian concept of limited government.
Well, let me ask you about what's almost through the history a dark underside of American conservatism, namely their positions on slavery. Now, you know, that was then, this is now, but as I understand it, and correct me if I'm misremembering this, Macon had real reservations about slavery, but he did not think as a landowner that he could get along without slaves, right? Is that?
Well, I think, I don't know so much that. He definitely had reservations about slavery, but he didn't see the solution. I mean, he saw the problem coming for the South, but he just couldn't envision how it could be solved. Randolph was very interesting. Unlike Jefferson, who actually couldn't afford to free the slaves, Randolph freed his slaves, left in his will that he would free them, left enough money to buy farmland for them in Ohio, provided transportation for them to go to Ohio and settle, which the administrator of his estate accomplished, got them out to Ohio, and then very sadly, the Ohioans confiscated their land and ran them off. So it was a very sad.
And where did they go?
They I've forgotten what the name of the town was that they were near. They wound up just going into the town and working in the town, but they didn't have their farmland that Randolph had provided for them. So it was a sad chapter. And
not a successful experiment.
I guess they did get their freedom, which was good. But
yeah. Was there a discussion at that time about doing in the United States what actually England ended up doing with the leadership of William Wilberforce, namely ending slavery, compensating the slave owners in the West Indies to, in a way, buy them off?
Well, there were a couple of schemes that were bandied about. One was sending slaves back, recolonization to Liberia, and some of that was accomplished. There was some talk about compensating. In fact, there was a Virginia plan, I think in the 1820s, that was proposed in the state legislature that would have compensated slave owners. But what unfortunately happened with just the explosion in the cotton production and the value of slaves went through the roof, and it became such a valuable economic proposition that the numbers were, by the time the Civil War came, if that had been the solution, it would have been very costly for the Union actually to
right.
It probably wouldn't have been economically palatable for the rest of the Union to
yeah, early on, I
that.
think the Virginia legislature came within a vote of abolishing slavery within the Commonwealth, but that was early,
right.
And then it became progressively more difficult as time went on. So the tertium quids, basically, which again, one of you knows something about, and now more, and the rest of why? Who cares? Why should we remember them?
Well, I think one thing is, as you look back in history, the tertium quids was a group that did not get much respect politically. They were respected as individuals, but they certainly were not. They were marginalized because of their views within the Jefferson and Madison administrations, the Monroe administration. But they stuck to their principles, and ultimately their principles survived, and I think we can look back and be thankful for that. But it was fairly costly for them. That was the reason Macon, he served, I think it was 3 terms as Speaker of the House and then was not reelected, and it was because he had just voted no too many times.
Okay. So this, by the way, is the book, Conservative Heroes, and it has the pictures on the cover of these 14 leaders. And I'm going to continue to ask about the lesser-known ones. There is a good chapter on John C. Calhoun, but I suspect you've taken American history, you know something about Calhoun. One of the presidents that we know least about, probably, at least most people, is Grover Cleveland. And he's actually one of my favorites, too. I wrote a little bit about him, but you've written here. Why should we care about Cleveland? What does he have to teach us?
Well, I would argue that Cleveland was certainly one of the 3 most successful conservative presidents, if you define modern times as going back 130 or 40 years. And he was certainly the last conservative Democrat to serve as president. No question about that. I think Cleveland is an interesting example. He was... his political career was absolutely meteoric. He'd been sort of a mediocre lawyer in Buffalo, nothing very exciting about what he had done. He was elected mayor and came to it took on some local corrupt politicians on the local scene. Because of that, he was nominated for governor of New York, served as governor 2 years, and then was nominated for president. And so in 3.5 years, he went from a mediocre lawyer to mayor to governor to president. And he recounted to some of his friends that for months after getting to the White House, he'd wake up in the morning and rub his eyes and say, gee, I can't believe I'm here. And that was probably true. He probably couldn't believe he was there. Right. But he turned out to be a very principled conservative. He had, when he was elected, nobody knew exactly, what he was going to do. And he, somewhat like Ronald Reagan, zeroed in on really 3 areas that he wanted to see some change in. And one of them was a substantial reduction of the federal government. And he still holds the record for the number of vetoes of any president. He vetoed over 500 bills that were passed by Congress, mostly spending bills. And he was willing to take on his own party, the press, the Republicans, whatever, when he thought he was right. And he had a very, I think, a very good quote. He would, if somebody would come to him and say, look, this is really, you need to move towards the center or you're not making any progress here, he would just beat his fist on the table and say, what good is it to be elected if you don't stand for anything? And so that was really Grover Cleveland. He, just a quick sidelight, he was a formidable character intellectually. I mean, he was a very principled politician, but he was also pretty formidable as a person. He weighed close to 300 pounds and was, by the standards of that day, a pretty good sized fellow.
Second heaviest president ever after William Howard Taft?
I think that's probably right. I don't know that he required a special bathtub, but like Taft, but maybe close to it.
Okay, so 1884 election, this little-known fellow, Grover Cleveland, from mayor of Buffalo to governor of New York, and getting some traction against the Republican candidate, James Blaine, who was the Speaker of the House and a major Republican politician, and I can't resist this. Okay, if you're a Democrat in the 1884 election, you would be chanting, "Blaine, Blaine, continental liar from the state of Maine."
Right.
Okay, and then the Republicans, of course, come back with.
Well, there was the story that surfaced that Cleveland had fathered a child illegitimately, and it was never proven, but.
Although he did pay child support. So,
well, I think actually he did pay child support.
Yeah,
I think he did. But I think the consensus was that it was probably his law partner, but his law partner died, and Cleveland said, well, I'm not going to do anything to impugn the integrity of my dead law partner, so he said, I'll bear full responsibility. Okay. So anyway, that story got out, and when it got out, Cleveland's people came to him and said, oh, what should we do about this? He said, well, just tell the truth. And so the the Republicans got the slogan. They were yelling back at the Democrats, Ma, Ma, where's my pa? And, the cartoon showed the little baby tugging on her mother's apron strings, where's my pa? And the Democrats added to that after the election, gone to the White House, ha, ha, ha. So
they had the last laugh.
Yeah, they had the last laugh on the quips.
So colorful campaigns, we don't have to just wait for Donald Trump or something. There were campaigns back in 1884.
Well, that's exactly right. And Cleveland was certainly somebody who was elected who the electorate didn't really know much about. They didn't know exactly what he was going to do. His elected tenure in office was so short, but they found out very quickly, and he didn't deviate.
Of course, if any of you learned in homeschool or other places list of presidents of the United States, Grover Cleveland is the one who messes everything up by being both the 22nd and the 24th.
That's right.
Because he's elected, then defeated by Benjamin Harrison, and then reelected or elected anew in 1892. At which point things went downhill. There's a depression,
right.
And Pitchfork Ben Tillman got his name in part by saying he was a Southern leader. Georgia, was it? And
South Carolina,
South
Georgia.
Carolina?
I was trying to think. Yeah, you're right. It was Georgia.
Well, maybe, but anyway, Ben Tillman, a senator, a leading political person, said, "I want a pitchfork to stick through Grover Cleveland's fat guts." So, again, these were not the good old days of everyone being sweet campaigners and so forth. So, but okay, I need to ask you about the 1887 Texas Seed Bill and what that tells us about Grover Cleveland and the understanding back then of how to fight poverty.
Well, the Cleveland issued as I mentioned a minute ago, held the record for the number of vetoes. So he issued a lot of veto messages, and he used those messages to really impart his theory of government. And the Texas Seed Bill example was a very good one. It was a very minor thing. I think there was a drought out in Texas, and I don't know, they needed to get some seeds to the farmers so they could plant the next year's crop or something like that, and it was, it seemed like to me it was under $100,000, I think, for the whole thing. Well, anyway, Cleveland vetoed it and said two things. He said, first of all, this is, nowhere in the Constitution is this prescribed, therefore we should resist at all costs, no matter how worthy the cause is, inventing things that aren't prescribed in the Constitution. And he said, secondly, this is the kind of thing that can be better handled by charitable gifts. And in fact, within, I think it was 30 days after his veto, the charitable gifts had come in and they'd raised 50% more money than they were going to get in the government bill. But that was, if you go back and read those, it's a fairly short veto message. It's just a couple of paragraphs, but you would have a hard time imagining any politician today uttering those words, particularly for something like seed bills.
Relatively small amount of money, big need, but Cleveland said, hey, the Dallas Morning News can publicize the need and ask people to contribute, and that's in fact what happened.
Yeah.
So Grover Cleveland. Let's move to another. Your first book was on the 1924 election between John W. Davis, who was the Democratic candidate, and Calvin Coolidge, the Republican candidate. Tell us about Davis. We may know a little bit about Coolidge. Well, the important thing to know about Coolidge is that he was known as Silent Cal. And there's the story about the woman who bet a friend of hers that she was going to be sitting next to him at dinner and she could make him say more than 2 words in the course of the whole evening. And she told that story to President Coolidge sitting next to her, to which Coolidge replied.
Looked at her and said, well, you lose.
I think he left out the well.
Yeah.
I think he just said, you lose.
Yeah, that's right. He didn't say, well, he just said, you lose.
You lose.
Yeah.
So anyway, and she did. And she did. Thus, a very rare phenomenon among presidents of the United States or politicians generally. But that's Calvin Coolidge. But John W. Davis, who knows about John W. Davis? We had one person for Nathaniel Macon, or the Tertium Quids. No takers for John W. Davis. Tell us about Davis.
Well, Davis is absolutely a forgotten person in American history, and I think very sadly. He was the Democratic nominee in 1924, ran against Coolidge, and was soundly defeated. But interestingly, Davis was the last conservative ever nominated by the Democrats, and arguably the modern Democratic Party that we know today sort of came out of that election where the Democrats said, well, we've gotten clobbered by the Republicans and Coolidge, we're just going to stay on the left and let the Republicans stay on the right. But Davis was in many ways an extraordinary man. He served as U.S. ambassador to Great Britain, was in the House first, then was Solicitor General under Wilson. Went to England as a U.S. ambassador under Wilson, came back. In his words, he was dead broke after spending 2 years as the ambassador. Back in those days, the ambassador had to spend his own money. And so he came back and said he really had to earn some money. So he joined a major New York law firm and became one of the great lawyers in really in American history. He argued more cases before the Supreme Court than any other American except Daniel Webster. He argued 142 cases. And the chapter in the book, in this book, really focuses on his contribution in the 1930s and 40s of taking New Deal legislation and challenging it before the Supreme Court and being very successful in getting the court to overturn many of Roosevelt's pet New Deal projects. In fact, Roosevelt called Davis at one point public enemy number one, which Davis really loved and thought that was just fine. But Davis was just one of those people that sort of wherever he went, whatever he did, he had, I guess what you would say, sort of a magnetic personality. I mean, people just really loved him. The Supreme Court, when he was Solicitor General, every member of the Supreme Court asked Wilson to appoint him to the Supreme Court. He just had that kind of appeal. He was president of the American Bar Association, J.P. Morgan's lawyer, just really quite an outstanding man. And one of the, well, I just mentioned two things quickly. His last two cases were probably his most famous two. One was the what's known as the steel seizure case, the Youngstown Steel case, where President Truman took over the steel mills during the Korean War, and Davis represented the steel companies, took it to court.
Davis at this point is something, 80 something?
Yeah, he was 80 years old.
Okay.
Argued the case by himself before the Supreme Court and secured a decisive ruling. And I saw, it was interesting, I guess the case is maybe before the, I guess it's before the court now on Obama's immigration actions. And the steel seizure case is one of the precedent cases for that. So,
where the president took action.
Yeah, that was not justified. And then his last case was the Brown versus Board of Education case, which he argued on the side of South Carolina against desegregation. He argued again, he was opposed by Thurgood Marshall, which was a very interesting, Davis and Marshall actually became very good friends. And Davis's position was not that segregation should be upheld, but that there either should be a constitutional amendment or it should be left to the states to work it out, which he was convinced would come, he thought, sooner rather than later. But those were his last two. I think the Brown versus Board of Education was his 142nd case before the court. So it's quite a career.
142 arguments for the court. Okay, now Brown versus Board of Education gets to the question again of the unfortunate and in some ways tragic tendency for conservatives to take positions that would be seen as racist. So how do you, I mean, Davis, as you're saying, I mean, he saw this as a states' rights case. He also saw it as, if you're going to do it, do it with a constitutional amendment.
Right.
But how do you break that identification once it's cemented in the public mind?
Well, it's a difficult part of history right now to look back. I mean, it's certainly difficult to look back at John C. Calhoun. It's difficult to look back at Davis and Brown versus Board of Education. Through the prism that we look at, because I mean everybody would certainly be in agreement that it's good that segregation is gone. But I think there's a real constitutional issue there. I was reading just a day or two ago, I thought it was very interesting. Thomas Sowell was writing about race and constitutional issues and all, and he was talking about the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which he said was although certainly the objective was good and the result as far as race was good, but that the means to achieving that end, in his view, his words were disastrous. That if you could tell somebody, his example was, well, if you can tell somebody who they have to serve in their restaurant, then it's not long before you can be telling them who they have to bake cakes for, and he was relating it to the current same-sex marriage questions and religious freedom and all that. And I think it's certainly it's interesting to see someone like Sowell make that case, because it's very difficult for any non-black to make a statement like that. But I think Sowell was absolutely right, and Davis was right. There's a very famous Alexander Bickel, who was a very famous legal scholar, Yale professor, wrote a book on the 1950 on the Brown versus Board of Education 54 decision, and he said there was no question that Davis's argument, which was the case had already been decided 3 times, the issue had already been decided, it was all on precedent, all on states' rights, everything, that really the only constitutional avenue was for constitutional amendment, but that what Thurgood Marshall, arguing the other side, made his pitch to, and what the court bought into, was basically a sociological argument that it was dangerous and harmful to people, and it wasn't, and it just kind of, in Bickel's words, it turned the old order upside down. And once you did that, Davis made an interesting observation. He said if the court does this, they'll wind up being a school board, and that's exactly what happened. They were, busy studying maps and doing busing and all of that, and running the schools, which was not a good thing for the schools.
Sociological rather than constitutional logic. Another person, probably even less known than John W. Davis, Senator Bailey from North Carolina.
Yeah, I've had more fun.
How many? Anyone? No? I wouldn't think so. Tell us about
I'd
Bailey.
be shocked if anybody raised his hand on Bailey. Well, Bailey actually is from Raleigh, which is where I'm from, and I have to admit I would have never run across Bailey if my father hadn't grown up 2 doors down from Senator Bailey. So I had heard about Senator Bailey all my life, and before I started working on the book, I was reading. There is one biography of Bailey, and I was reading it, and nobody in North Carolina even knows much about Bailey anymore. And but I was really struck by the reason he's in the book are the 2 things. He was really the primary mover in the Senate for blocking FDR's court packing scheme, which was a big deal in 1937. Roosevelt won a huge landslide in 36, had giant majorities in the Congress, everything was passing, but he was infuriated because the Supreme Court kept ruling that all this legislation, or a lot of this legislation, was unconstitutional. And some of these cases Davis was taking to the Supreme Court were getting knocked down. So Roosevelt's solution was that he was just going to arbitrarily submit an expansion, a law that would expand the Supreme Court. He just said they were overworked and
From what? From 9 to 15?
I think that's right. Yeah, 9 to 15. And Bailey, who was a very well-respected constitutional scholar, just he had been pretty vocal up to that point in opposing a lot of what Roosevelt did, but he just really opposed this. And he led the fight and was successful. It was the first time that Congress really pushed back on Roosevelt on any major legislation. And then that was in, I think it was September of 1937, and then later that year, Bailey, along with his two good friends from Virginia, Harry Byrd and Carter Glass, came up with the idea of something that was called the Conservative Manifesto, which was the first attempt to pull together a bipartisan coalition of Democrats and Republicans who would put up some resistance to Roosevelt. The Conservative Manifesto did not accomplish what Bailey had hoped, but it was, for about a week or 10 days, there was front page news on the New York Times, and it was interesting. It was disclosed prematurely. The Republican minority leader in the Senate was concerned that somehow he was concerned that this Conservative Manifesto might undermine his position, so he leaked it to the press, and before Bailey had rounded up the signatures, and then the more timid souls kind of all fled for the sidelines, and Bailey gave a really rousing speech on the floor of the Senate and defended it, but it never really accomplished what he hoped it would do. But those two things in 1937 were key congressional pushbacks against the New Deal.
So I don't want to keep beating this horse, but insofar as it's a real drag on conservative success, the association with segregation, racism, and so forth, where was Bailey on that? I don't know, and I'm just curious.
Well, he was a conventional Southerner, and I'm sure I actually don't recall ever reading, and I haven't read everything he ever wrote or said, but I don't remember ever reading anything that he actually wrote about segregation.
Okay.
I'm sure he would have been a defender of it, or he would have been against. I suspect he was against Truman's Civil Rights Bill, like most every Southerner. Bailey was definitely in the Harry Byrd camp, which was, I guess, depending on your point of view, either more moderate, or you could say with a genteel veneer on top of their racism, if you want to look at it that way. But Bailey was not a rabble rouser. He was not a Cotton Ed Smith.
Not a pitchfork guy.
Yeah, not a pitchfork Tillman or that kind of guy.
Okay. Now let's see. We'll go to more recent history, and let's talk a little bit about Ronald Reagan, because those of you who weren't there at the time, you might think, since he's a very popular president now, that he was pretty much got unanimous support. Democrats loved him, and so forth. A little bit different in the reality of the period.
Well, it definitely was, and in the book at least it's the last chapter of the book, and deals with Buckley, Goldwater, and Reagan together, which I think is a good way to look at Reagan, because I think in many ways he was really the ultimate product of Buckley's success. And
this is William F. Buckley, who was the founder, banker, and editor of
National Review and lots of other things. But it's, I think, very interesting if you go back and if you read that chapter. Buckley graduated from Yale in 1950 and amazingly came onto the national scene. He authored a book called God and Man at Yale, which I would really strongly recommend each of you all to read. I don't think I'd ever read it. If I had, it was a long time ago, but I reread it when I was writing this chapter, and it's first of all, it's remarkable that anybody in his early 20s could write a book like that, or was thinking as deeply about those things as he was.
I suspect any of you could, but
yeah.
That's not.
Well, maybe I was thinking more about what I was doing or thinking when I was 20, but it was really amazing. I mean, he put his finger. I mean, in hindsight, he put his finger right on the problem with American higher education and what he viewed as the capitulation of the American college education system to liberal thinking. And sadly, he came up with the antidote for that, but it didn't, nobody paid any attention. His solution, which certainly makes sense, is alums don't go along with this liberal philosophy, so they should just cut off their giving to their schools. Well, I guess in the last 60 years, the American colleges have raised more money than any period in human history. So unfortunately...
but what if the football team is successful?
Yeah, well, I guess that's what drives it.
Patrick Henry doesn't worry about that.
Yeah, but back to Buckley's emergence on the scene. I mean, what was interesting, he was a well-known character on the campus at Yale. He was viewed as probably the most brilliant student intellectually. He was on the debate team, very articulate, and he was invited by Yale to deliver one of two graduation addresses. He was not the valedictorian, but he was going to deliver the other address. And probably wisely, the administration got kind of concerned about what Buckley might say and asked him to submit a copy of his talk in advance, which he did. And they read it and got very alarmed and said, well, you can't say this, you're going to have to really change it. He refused to change it. So they uninvited him, and he didn't speak at Yale. Well, anyway, that irritated him so much, he decided he would turn the speech into a book and wrote the book, which became almost an immediate bestseller and just sent Yale into a tailspin. They were so concerned about this upstart who was being critical of them and their philosophy and everything, but it set Buckley's career off at quite a fast pace. And Buckley decided, I think, very early on that he really wanted to become the voice for what he called responsible conservatism, and he was very good at pulling together what had been somewhat disparate strands of the conservative movement, pulled them into National Review, got some of the best writers in the country, and it really took off as a magazine. And what Buckley really did was, there are a lot of quotes. It's very easy to document this. If you go back to the late 40s, early 50s, it was the consensus among American intellectuals that the philosophical debate was really over, that liberalism had won, that conservatism really wasn't even a bona fide philosophy. You couldn't be intelligent and be a conservative. They just felt there wasn't a debate. That was almost, well, it was conventional wisdom. And Buckley, I would say, single-handedly turned that on in. I mean, he was so entertaining, so brilliant as a spokesman, as a debater, as a speaker, that it just demolished the argument. He was you couldn't listen to William Buckley and say, well, you can't be intelligent and be a conservative. And so the success he had with National Review and some other things like ISI and the publishing company. And
ISI is the Intercollegiate Studies Institute.
Right. And and Young Americans for Freedom. He was involved in the start of that. The political manifestation of all of that was Barry Goldwater's nomination in 1964. And I guess, sort of the conventional wisdom, or certainly the easy way to describe or dismiss Goldwater's '64 election was he was soundly trounced by Lyndon Johnson. And a lot of people predicted that that was the end of conservatism, that the Republicans had finally nominated a real conservative. He'd gotten clobbered and they shouldn't do that again. But I think it was George Will who said Goldwater ran in '64. He actually won the election, but it was just 16 years later that the votes were counted. And it was in 1980 when Reagan ran very much with Buckley's support that you sort of have the full outworkings of the Buckley, Goldwater, and finally Reagan. And you know, it's not as, it's probably a little bit of a distant memory now, but at the end of Reagan's term, I mean, there was some argument that, well, maybe liberalism's dead, you know, that we're going to have a, you know, I mean, Margaret Thatcher was going strong, and Reagan was viewed as highly successful, and Reagan's successor had just been elected, George H.W. Bush, and you know, people were saying, well, maybe the debate's over now, the conservatives won. And it was really a remarkable achievement that Buckley, Goldwater, and Reagan brought.
Yeah, there's no particular reason except historical interest for you all to know about Nathaniel Macon and John Randolph. But, you know, if you learn a little bit about Buckley and Goldwater and Reagan, you could get into some interesting discussions with your parents or grandparents. Reagan did not end up his administration, his second term, hugely popular.
Well, there was no doubt that I guess some of his foreign policy things seemed to kind of run off the rails there towards the end, and it's difficult. I guess most presidents in their second term trail off a bit, but I think it was very significant that his vice president was elected. I think that was an affirmation of Reagan's.
His vice president being?
George H.W. Bush. And I think everybody would agree if Reagan had been 10 years younger and there hadn't been a constitutional amendment, he could have probably won a third term. I think he was popular enough for that. And then, of course, when he actually died, I think a lot of liberals were really very surprised with the outpouring and the affection that Americans had for him. But, you know, I would make the point that I think it's interesting and I think useful to look back. I think the three conservative presidents, I would argue, that were the most successful were Cleveland, Coolidge, and Reagan. And none of those was elected with a great expectation from the public that they were going to be great presidents. Cleveland was not very well known. Coolidge was an accidental president, came in when Harding died, and then was elected sort of during his honeymoon period. And Reagan, Marvin's right, I mean, there was just a deep-seated feeling, particularly among liberal Democrats, that Reagan was not very smart. He was just a B-grade actor, that he wasn't up to the job. You know, well, I mean, I think right up until Election Day, they couldn't imagine that he would even be elected. And then when he was elected, they said, oh my gosh, you know, what are we going to do? But there was, in retrospect, he's viewed much differently. And you know, as we think about who the next conservative hero will be, I think that's one good thing to keep in mind, that maybe oftentimes we really don't know until somebody gets in the office and has a chance to really grapple with the issues, and we find out whether he or maybe she, you know, really have focus to stick with principles and.
Yeah, and that's one consolation if you look out over the political landscape and you just see it icy and barren and disappointing. You know, these things go in cycles. If any of you have seen the movie Field of Dreams, you may remember James Earl Jones talking about the one constant in America, which is baseball. Well, actually, that is true. The other constant is that presidents arise out of nowhere in many ways, or and unexpectedly do some great things.
Yeah.
And then sometimes, of course, those who go in and are hailed the most actually are real embarrassments.
And I would hope, if certainly my hope and objective tonight would be to tempt you at least to read the book. I hope what would come out to you in that is that each of these leaders, the 14 leaders, were absolutely men of real principle, and their principles were very similar. I think if you look, and that's one point of the book, that this conservative tradition really does go back to the beginning of the country. But I think Reagan made a very good quote late in his second term. He made the comment, he said, I've never viewed myself or thought of myself as a great man, but rather a man who's committed to great principles. And I think that's what sets these people apart. They really were, if you ask them to tell you what they believe, they could really tell you, and they didn't mind telling you, and they didn't really care whether you liked it or not. They hoped you would vote for them, but if you didn't like it, they weren't going to change just because they needed to change to win an election.
Yeah, he also said, I'm paraphrasing here, you can accomplish an amazing amount if you don't care who gets the credit.
Yeah.
Questions for any of you about any of these folks? We haven't talked about John C. Calhoun or Robert Taft. If you're dying to know something about them, this is your opportunity, or anything else. You can even ask questions about the current American leadership, political campaigns, presidential possibilities.
Thank you. I had a question concerning Ronald Reagan's policies, especially in his defense of the policies against interracial couples at Bob Jones University. Would you say that as we talked about before, not to beat a dead horse, but was that more of a conservative reaction to the laws and the rights of the school rather than the rights of the individuals that were at that college at the time?
I'm trying to think. I remember. I'm trying to think what the exact issue was. I guess, did Bob Jones lose their tax-exempt status?
Right.
And was that while Reagan was president?
That I believe was while Reagan was president. I'm not sure of that, and I'm not sure of the position he took. Do you know he was?
Sorry, we mentioned this earlier in the day. That's why I brought it up. But I believe he defended Bob Jones University with their policy, but on the grounds of the college's right to be able to use discretion in their policies.
Okay.
Yeah, I would have suspected that Reagan probably would have not. I would have suspected he would have defended Bob Jones's right to do that, not necessarily defended the policy as a good one or the right one, but I think that gets back into what we were talking about earlier. If the more issues the government decides what you have to do, then the more issues in the future they can decide what you have to do. And so that would have definitely been a concern that Reagan had.
Yeah, so in other words, one would think, just thinking through these principles here, private institution should be allowed to do this, even if you don't like it. But then, of course, if you start having federal money involved, that changes the whole equation.
Yeah.
So, other questions or comments on any of this? Okay, over here.
you. My question was, how do you think modern conservatism compares to that of, say, the conservatives of the Jeffersonian era?
Well, in the very beginning of the book, I'd take just a few pages and suggest that there are at least five very basic principles of conservatism. And I think I would argue that those principles have been consistent all the way through American history, that there are things like limited government and the importance of private property and these things. And I think the tertium quids and Jefferson and Madison would have been just as strong on those as, say, Buckley, Goldwater, and Reagan. So I think those issues the basic principles were very similar. Now, obviously, each generation has different issues that they have to deal with, and whether it was slavery or desegregation or the tariff or whatever. Each generation has to apply the principles, but I think the principles are really pretty similar.
So you define conservatism as a realistic view of human nature?
Well, I think that's the starting point. And I think the key thing there is somehow liberals believe or seem to believe that human nature is perfectible or is getting better, is progressively getting better, and ultimately could be perfected, and that government is the best means of securing that perfection. And conservatives just see no indication that it's getting any better, and certainly don't think it's perfectible, and certainly wouldn't think the government was the best means to perfect it.
So we are fallen creatures in need of redemption by God.
That's right.
So if you don't, when you have conservatism without that Christian base, what tends to happen to it?
Well, and in fact, that's the first of the 5 points. The last one is that any society, government, whatever, and the American government's no exception, really needs an undergirding of personal virtues that the people believe or buy into, just sort of. And in our case, it has always been, and hopefully still is, the Judeo-Christian heritage. If you don't have that common denominator, then it's pretty hard to have a cohesive, you certainly don't have a cohesive worldview among the population, and if you're in a democracy and everybody's voting based on some alternative worldview, then that doesn't bode very well. So you need to have, or the importance of those personal virtues, a conservative would say, is very important. A liberal would put more emphasis on demographic factors or economic factors or geographic factors or whatever. But,
I love American history, and I really enjoy these stories. I hope some of you will delve into this. I have 2 announcements to make here in closing. Number 1, my beloved wife, Susan, wave to your admirers, does stories for World Radio podcast, and she's now in the process of putting together a feature on the ideas put forward by a new author named Thomas Unstadt. The name of his book is Why Courtship is Fundamentally Flawed. So she's interviewing people who like courtship ideas, who dislike courtship ideas. She would like to talk to some people about why they disagree or agree with that view, why courtship is fundamentally flawed. And she'll be here hanging around this coffee house tomorrow afternoon between 1 o'clock and 4 o'clock to hear, with her trusty tape recorder, stories of people who either have had or believe they will have success with courtship or want to have nothing to do with it. So if you're interested in talking with her about that, again, between 1 and 4 tomorrow, she'll be here. Secondly, at 6 o'clock tomorrow, we'll have another interview that won't be much about history, American history, except more on personal history. A fellow who will be coming tomorrow at 6 o'clock is Bob Beckel. You may have seen him on the 5,
Yeah.
on Fox. And he has a book coming out early in November with the title, I may be misstating it a little bit, but I think the title is something like I Should Be Dead. And it's a memoir about why he should be dead, namely because of the very rascally life that he led, which included husbands of various women wanting to shoot him at times, which included him being beaten up, drugs, alcohol, you name it, until early in this century he was redeemed by Christ. And that's changed his life and a lot of the way he thinks about things. So I think it'll be a really fun session tomorrow night from between 6 and 7 to hear Bob Beckel with Cal Thomas, his good friend who helped him learn about Christ, coming as a hitherto anonymous guest, perhaps making an appearance, waving to his fans, but otherwise just being here to keep Bob Beckel perhaps from driving off the road. No, he doesn't. That's not a problem anymore. But anyway, please join me now in thanking our guest here for this book that I hope you all read, Garland, Tucker, Conservative Heroes. So thank you for coming.
Armin, thank you.